Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the J Plus R Movie Podcast. We will be discussing The Dinner, starring Richard Gere, Steve Coogan, Laura Linney, and Rebecca Hall. The basic kind of plot setup is that it's about four wealthy people who are kind of connected by family who are meeting up at this, high class restaurant to discuss a recent crime that their children have committed. Throughout it, we're kind of getting stuff about their family history and also like about the crime itself. This isn't among the worst films that we've covered, but it's definitely among the most disappointing and frustrating because this film had a lot of potential to be really, really good, and it's got an interesting premise. It's got a very talented director and writer. It's got a fantastic set of four really good actors, but unfortunately, the end result is all over the place. It's really, really annoying. And it's just a very, very unpleasant, very disjointed film, I feel.
I mean, I don't think it quite works. The only thing is it's not aggressively bad. It's just not good.
I actually did not think this movie was very well made at all. And we'll talk about the editing last because that kind of ties into the storytelling. But I want to start out by saying that I thought that this movie looked really, really ugly. It had this really blurry, just ugly look to it that made the film to me look a lot cheaper than it was, especially whenever we were having flashbacks, because the flashbacks in particular, again, they did this kind of effect that you do sometimes see with flashbacks in movies. But to me, all of the flashbacks were so unappealing to look at.
Well, yeah, it's because they were very flat in the way that they were lit and done, very, very bright, and there wasn't too much contrast, and they almost try and overdo the contrast throughout the rest of the film, so it feels really, really disjointed. And there's something wrong with the reds, just color grade wise. They're not trying to imply that these characters are drunk for most of the film.
Mm-hmm. No,
everything is bathed in this red light. All their faces are just too red, and it does make it feel a bit ugly because it's almost like they didn't light it right.
The only time that kind of is effective is towards the end when they're sitting in that dark room, when it's like Paul and his wife Claire when they're both sitting in the room. In that bit, there was dark lighting there, but that looked fine. That looked intentional. Whereas every other time it was
it looked underexposed rather than moody, which is what I feel like they were going for.
Weird mixture of underexposed and overexposed, especially that flashback.
Oh god, the flashback.
Well, all of them, but particularly then where it was flashing back to showing it stands formal wife. The coloring in there was really, really bright at one flashback, and that's kind of a problem all throughout the film. I'm sure that they were going for some sort of color symbolism, maybe, but I wasn't really sure what they were trying to imply by making it look the way that it did. Some of the stuff when it's showing the kids committing the crime in progress as well also looked really bad. The stuff when they were in the ATM, I don't know why it looked the way it did, but I don't even know how to describe how it looked.
Do the old adage of let's blow out the flashbacks so that they contrast with the modern day stuff, and let's have them in stark light, as in, oh yeah, this is the truth kind of thing. I feel like that's what they were doing with the light, but
yeah, or blur it slightly to make it look like a memory. But to be honest, even the modern day stuff looked kind of like that. So that to me was kind of a problem. I mean, there was a difference in visuals, don't get me wrong, but none of them looked good. It just wasn't a good film to look at for me personally.
I definitely hate the restaurant stuff. I mean, I'm more annoyed with the restaurant stuff than the flashback stuff, because at least the flashback stuff I can kind of see what they were going for, but it's an oddly orange thing to me. Too warm, and obviously it's quite a hostile environment there. Lighting of that restaurant does not reinforce the tone of the characters at all. So the characters is kind of the way that they speak to each other, and them, because they really don't like each other very much. They're disagreeing heavily, but you don't care because there's nothing to reinforce it. It's also just weirdly dark. Just points where their faces are kind of you still always see their faces, but they're just underlit, and you're kind of this is kind of annoying to look at.
I think what's even worse is a couple of other things that they do. For example, so many of the shots in this movie that zoom in or out, and that's a motif that feels very, very self-conscious. To have so many shots be a pull in or a pull out, when you just do it a few times, it can work. But when you do it so much, it feels like it's calling attention to itself. And I think that the editing is the worst part by far. Before we get to the actual editing, I want to focus on a couple of little bit opening credits. That also looked very, very sloppy, and the reason why it looked sloppy is because it was just B-roll of later scenes. Not quite clear on first viewing, but when you go back and look at it, it's scenes of food being prepared intercut with B-roll of later scenes. That they were trying to like set the stage for later events, but something about it being B-roll of later scenes made it almost feel a bit thrown together. Like that wasn't originally intended to be there.
I mean, the closest thing I've seen to that opening credits in terms of like, using the old clips, the last time I've seen that was in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films. And it worked there because it wasn't B-roll.
The first one, it visuals of important things, and in the second two, they're basically just recapping the prior films. It's not like they're showing clips of the film you're about to watch. It's like they're showing clips of the prior film. That worked a lot better. Yeah,
because it was just kind of things for the film. It wasn't even necessarily the same take that they used later in the film.
In this instance, yeah, it was. These could have been shots that you saw, or they could have just been like alternate takes, maybe. But something about that felt sloppy to me. And editing in this film as well really bothered me. It bothered me in one particular way. Paul's narration, the first like two instances where they do it, in the very first scene, I legitimately thought that they were going to transition to another scene of him giving a lecture. He's like a history teacher. It's just a scene of him like standing on this like porch or whatever, and like we're hearing his like internal monologue is like doing all this pontificating, and the way it's recorded made me think he was like giving that lecture in a class, because it has this very echoey sound. They don't do that. It's just him internally monologuing, so that confused me. But the bit that stuck out to me even more, and maybe they thought they were clever by doing this, but this was just very, very distracting. That flashback that I was talking about, where it's showing like
the ex-wife
during that bit, right? They start out by having him, it's not really a monologue, it's just like him reading out this book that he's reading. And they start out with that, but then instead of just cutting off that narration when we're seeing Claire and Stan's ex-wife interacting, they like reduce it to background noise. That really threw me off, because then I was like, wait, is he like listening to a tape recording of himself? Because he's not speaking. And then I was like, oh, okay, it's him internally saying this stuff. It's just, and it also just distracted from, I'm not saying the background noise is distracting, but by doing that, it distracted me from what the two women were saying to each other as well. Did you notice that?
It felt odd, because it would take you a second to realise, oh, that this is his internal one. Okay. Yeah, it just sounded off. I mean,
so this is connected to the editing as well. The editing and structure of this movie is what really, really brings it down for me. At the core, you've got a really interesting premise. Like, you've got it's one that could probably sustain a film just purely on its own.
Yeah, the kind of moral consequences of trying to figure out what to do about one of your kids murdering someone. That's just a great question.
But the problem with this film is that it's not really about that.
I found it tried to focus a lot more on Stan and Paul's relationship not being amazing, and Paul and his wife not having a great relationship, and just kind of parental failures. And maybe that was, I don't know, maybe that was part of the point. They were going, oh, see, it's the parents' fault. But they didn't really make that particularly clear.
It focuses so heavily on that stuff that there's not much attention paid to the actual like fundamentals of like the premise like until towards the end of the film. But it could have been fine if maybe the flashbacks that we were seeing more clearly tied into what was going on, and they try to in a couple of places. Like maybe they try to imply that Paul's like issues with mental illness and some of these conflicts somehow implanted themselves onto Michael, onto his son. But the issue is that based on the way Michael's behaving, it just seems like he was born evil. It doesn't seem like he's like burdened by any kind of trauma. It doesn't seem like he's acting out because like the closest they get is you get that flashback of the basketball being thrown in, and how Paul is kind of trying to cover for his son and stuff, and get his son out of trouble. And in that sense, it's like, okay, well, I guess maybe he was kind of coddled a little bit, so he's perfectly fine with doing bad things. Then in other bits, it just doesn't make sense. Like the bit where Michael the son sees Stan getting hit with the pan, and I think there's the implication there that was supposed to have influenced his like violent behavior. Doesn't make sense, because how would seeing that all of a sudden make him perfectly okay with setting a homeless person on fire? It just doesn't connect.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. I mean, if he'd then hit her with a blunt object and started it off like that, and then the others started making like weirder suggestions, that I would get. Let's set this woman on fire. It's like, really?
He's throwing like matches at her, I mean, it's a bit more than just throwing matches. Like he throws stuff at her, but he also throws matches at her. So it's not just a mere act of violence. It's like it's almost sadistic torture in a sense. And that's kind of a problem. But what's even more of a problem is that like we go into so much detail in these flashbacks, and just them being placed in the way that they are, it just makes for a film that feels very aimless because we just don't know really where it's going. All we really know is that we're eventually going to see the end of the flashback where the kid is killing the homeless woman. But other than that, it's just not clear where this film is going.
Well, no, exactly. I mean, you know the basics of the premise fairly early, and you know, right, that's got to get resolved. But you're kind of there going, okay, we're with this stuff. Okay, we're still with this stuff, and it doesn't really all wrap up at the end, particularly.
We'll get to that a bit later on, but yeah, so in terms of the chronology, it's somewhat consistent in the sense that there are like three different timelines that we're focusing on. Stuff in the flashbacks when their sons were a lot younger, the crime being committed, and then the modern day stuff of them at like the restaurant. All of them do technically take place in chronological order, but the way that they kind of transition from one to the other is very awkward and sloppy. Particularly like when they transitioned randomly from Stan saying like that like, this is going to be a private matter to his like aide, and then we go to that flashback of the kid saying, "Oh man, we need to like get a cab." The transition between those two instances I thought was quite jarring and didn't really work. The issue is that these flashbacks also, it's not just one scene; it's like multiple scenes taking place. Especially there's like a 20-minute long section of this film that is purely just a flashback. It just kind of slows the movie down. And okay, what's the focus? Are we just focusing on this now? You know, what is the main story of this film? It's juggling too much and it's going into so much detail that it almost feels like it doesn't want to talk about the main thing that it's about,
Yeah,
weirdly.
it's almost like trying to hide away from it. You know, it's trying to go, oh, you know, look at Paul, look at look at the hard life he's had. And I get that that starts to build the climax. I do get that. I can understand why it shows that, but we don't need that much detail on it. Like, I feel like some of it we didn't need to see particularly.
Some of it is important, or some of it at least seems like it would be important, but other stuff is just.
I think the biggest one that I think didn't need to be there, especially with the kind of relationship they're trying to build between Paul and his dad anyway, was having Stan trying to help him with his depression, because it was a bit like the whole point that you're trying to set up, especially with the AIDS at the start and the fact that he's distracted from dinner, is that Stan didn't really do all that much for Paul. But that he should have really done more. That's kind of part of the point of the relationship. And it's like, cool, but you can't then show him trying to help. I feel like the film wants us to kind of connect with Paul. I feel like he is the protagonist of the film.
Definitely is. So that is a very, very good point that you're bringing up as well. It's like if you just cut that whole section out of the film, then that probably would have made it a lot stronger. I like the idea of seeing Stan trying to be there for his brother, you know, because
Yeah.
you know, in a film with, and we'll get onto this later, in a film with like characters this like unlikable, it's kind of a good thing to at least like show a scene of one of them trying to be a good person. That being said, it probably wasn't good for the story. And well, the main reason why it wasn't good for the story was Gettysburg. Paul brings up Gettysburg because it said that, oh, okay, he's like writing like a book on it. And then it's good that you bring up that flashback was there because he was trying to like help out, you know, Paul with his like mental issues. We literally have a scene of them at the Gettysburg like museum or whatever, and then we get this. I think this was probably the worst directed scene in the film. We get this weird bit where it's supposed to, I guess, simulate them learning about the history of Gettysburg or like going on a tour. What they were trying to do was they were trying to go for some kind of like thing where it's like Paul was sort of indulging in his interest but losing his mind at the same time. But that's not really made very clear. So as a result, it feels like the movie is just going nuts. The way that they do it, it's like, you know, it's like they're like in the museum and then they're walking in different places. And intercut with this, you have these like visuals of like statues, narrator who's talking about the history of like the Gettysburg battle and the Civil War, and you have these like weird like these like crossfades as we're like going from one bit to another. You have like the movie just goes crazy in that scene.
Yeah, it kind of just like throws a lot of different details at you, and it's like, oh yeah, here's the history. Oh, cool. So here's Paul's mind. Here it's going. You know, you get to. I think the only thing I can think of is maybe they're trying to go with a more subjective interpretation of the event, and it was Paul's kind of like own interpretation. But even then, like, it just still feels disjointed in a way that doesn't fit particularly with his mental health issues. Like,
Yeah. Well, it doesn't fit because it's not intercut with stuff that like gives you that impression. It's intercut with them just like walking around. So it's almost like we're just getting a weird artistic version.
History lesson. Don't get me wrong. I love a history lesson. Loved history at school. I don't really expect one in a film unless it's relevant.
So it was literally about like the American Civil War.
The American
Guys,
Civil War never comes up again.
I laughed at that bit where like Paul, it shows him in like a hotel. He's on the phone to his wife and he just says, "You know what? I'm going to drop the Gettysburg stuff." I was like, "Great." So that entire bit was pointless. I see how that stuff could have maybe been incorporated in, but it
It,
just feels like a massive detour.
it could have been incorporated, but it wasn't. They had something with the setup. They could have done something. It doesn't come across as some like weirdo obsession thing. It just becomes cool. They went to a museum, I guess.
I feel like you could have just reduced that entire bit down to the bit where they're on the set, and then maybe the bit where they're on, like, when they're in the hotel or something like that. Like, you could have condensed that entire sequence down, and it would have probably been better. It just would have been less like disjointed as well. It was just so. It's one of the weirdest things I've ever seen in a movie. I've just never seen a movie do that before. Literally become like an artistic history tool. So to move on to kind of the script, I thought that, like, aside from Stan, maybe I hated every single character in this film.
I feel like the only reason I didn't hate Stan that much is because it was Richard Gere playing him.
He is charismatic. Annoying because all of the actors in this film are doing their best. All of them are doing very
Yeah,
well.
they absolutely are. I don't even think the performances are bad because they're
No,
not. They're just as good as they can be with this script.
I haven't seen Steve Coogan do dramatic work. I know that he has done some. I will admit, on occasion, he was really good. Like, there were moments where I'm like, I do see the role. I don't see you as an actor. You are kind of disappearing into this role. All four of the actors do really well. And they do get a lot of the moments where they really dig into the material. But the problem is that the characters they're playing are so unbelievably obnoxious and so dislikable that as a result, I just spent most of my time being really annoyed by them. Film, I feel, wanted you to sympathize with them.
I think Paul and Claire especially really want that sympathy there. Maybe Stan's wife, but honestly, again, I cared more about him than anyone else because he was the only one that was remotely interesting to me. Like,
Was the only one who seemed like a decent person, or at least seemed like he was trying to be a good guy.
yeah, he seemed like he was trying to be a good person, and he had an interesting conflict with the political angle. With Paul and Claire, they gave the impression that there was a slight detachment in their relationship. And to be fair, the scene that shows that I don't think was directed particularly well. I mean, they're facing each other and looking at each other pretty much the whole time. I mean, yes, through a mirror, so it's technically not facing each other, but like, they're both constantly looking at each other, and they don't seem to not like each other's presence, which is kind of the impression kind of are meant to get. I feel for a lot of it, like they've got an antagonistic relationship, but then none of their body language ever suggests that.
Again, the film, it wants you to, if not like, then at least understand and maybe again sympathize with these people. But they're such horrible people. The character especially was just so obnoxious. Every single scene with him, like, he would just not shut the fuck up, and every single scene he was always being a rude, condescending dick to people. And the moments where like you were supposed to more feel bad for him, even then I was just thinking, like, I know that sucks, having to deal with this, like, non-specified but seems like kind of extreme depression kind of illness that you have. But you're just kind of a terrible person, just kind of an annoying person. So I didn't enjoy being around him. Same especially goes for his wife. His wife was so fucking obnoxious, really immoral as well. I just couldn't stand her. I couldn't stand. Aside from Stan, I think the film didn't want me to like him.
It definitely didn't want you to like him. It pulls out all the stops, like when you've got a smarmy political character, it does everything it can to associate Stan with that. I mean, like, the aides being there at dinner, and at that point we still have some sort of a lingering connection to Paul, even though he's annoying. So they then go, "Oh right, look, he can't. He's got no time for his family, yada yada yada." Which is why the flashback scene annoys me so much because it ruins that setup.
Yeah.
It was clumsy, but it worked. And then it's like, so Stan's a decent enough. Then why are you being such a dick to him?
All of the stuff that it says is bad about Stan, it more just kind of says rather than actually shows. Like, everything that we see of him seems to imply that he's at least, like, moral, that he at least does care about his family. But they just kind of say stuff like Paul bringing up how him and his brother were, like, both being raised by their abusive mother, and how, like, Paul took all the, like, the beatings and stuff, and Stan wasn't, like, around, or stuff about how, like, Stan might be a bit of a womanizer, but they just say these things. We never really see them.
Also stuff like, oh yeah, him paying for this particular restaurant is a power move. Yada yada yada. It's like, really? Stan doesn't really seem to lord his power over him that much. He's just like, okay, we need to sort this out because I've got a thing and it's really important. And don't get me wrong, he's clearly making a moral compromise. And he's the only one that's clearly uncomfortable with making the compromise, but he's the one that pushes it a little bit. Yeah, but he's also there like, I mean, I don't want to put out my career if I, you know.
And he's even willing to give up his political career as well, just because of the fallout. You know, the other problem as well that characterizing the people this way is that half of this movie is arguing. That can work when you have very likable characters. What I describe it as is sometimes in drama, in these situations, it feels like you're trapped in a room with like two people arguing. And in the best instances, you're trapped in a room with two people that you don't want to argue. But when you're trapped in a room with two people that you don't like, or one person that you like but is getting like yelled at, you end up just kind of tuning out and just being annoyed by the constant yelling on display, because that's a lot of what this film is, and it just got very, very exhausting.
It is a lot of yelling. Those sort of like quiet moments for the characters to feel hurt, particularly.
For them to express like kindness to each other, like, more scenes of them being genuinely decent people would have helped. But this film, it's entirely just being completely dysfunctional. And at a certain point, I just wanted to tell them just to shut up. I just wanted them to shut up and to go away.
You definitely do. Like, you definitely get a point of, I don't even care if you fix this.
And that's also kind of made worse by the structural choice as well. In particular, the choice to like show the crime the way that they do, because had they just showed the entire sequence at the beginning of the film, then I feel like we could have been more on board with what was going on. But instead, what they choose to do is they choose to show it in pieces all throughout the film. And that's kind of an issue because throughout the film, you're kind of wondering, like, okay, what the hell happened? 40 minutes in, you get the idea of, okay, they probably did something terrible to this homeless woman. But even then, it's not until you see Paul watching, like, a YouTube video of them having set her on fire that you get an idea of what they did. And then even afterwards, we're still shown what they did.
Everyone had the flashback there.
As in, like, have Paul watch the video and then we transition to see, like, stuff that we didn't see. Putting it there could have worked, but I feel like putting it at the beginning would have been the best choice.
I do understand teasing it out. I would either put it in the spot, because if you've got the video anyway, and that's where you want to put out the, oh, cool, they set a homeless woman on fire bit, show the full thing there. You don't need it later. Or if you were going to use it as a linchpin to change the tone of the movie and what the conversation and what it's about and things like that, stick it in the midpoint. We get reinvigorated, we're reinterested.
By putting it out in the way that they did, like that, I don't know whether to like compliment this or not, but that flashback was just really disturbing and uncomfortable. I was very, very disturbed by like the bit where they were abusing her and like throwing the stuff at her and then set her on fire. I almost want to praise it, but I think it just kind of goes along with the rest of this film of just being very, very like mean-spirited.
To be fair, for that scene, I feel like it kind of worked because that was a mean-spirited moment, like Jesus Christ. But I didn't care. That's messed up. But I didn't emotionally connect with anyone particularly.
Not like a morally terrible moment for this kid. We don't know if he was like decent beforehand or if this was like, because in fact we just get the sense that he was probably always this terrible.
What I would have liked to have seen is like something about how the homeless woman was, because she wasn't a character as much as she was a plot device.
If she were a character, then that could have maybe worked.
Yeah, then I feel like I would have emotionally connected a bit more.
Presenting it in the way they did, it almost feels like emotionally manipulative. And something about a lot of stuff in this film just feels like it's trying to make you feel a certain way. As a result, it just comes off as like very like obvious and results in a really unpleasant viewing experience. To say a little bit more about the acting, I will admit the kid who played Michael, he's actually like a really good up-and-coming actor that I've noticed. He's called like Charlie Plummer, and he's really good. He's been in a lot of movies, and I've always really enjoyed him. I think he was the only one in this film who was annoying, but for the right reasons. He's annoying, but that was kind of the point. Like, I was annoyed by him, but it wasn't like to the point to where I was like, oh my god, get the hell off screen. I was more like, all right, I get it. You're just playing an evil bastard, you know, and he did that very well. No real like major weak links. I mean, I will admit that Steve Coogan, his accent was a little bit shaky.
I mean, it wasn't great. Part of it is obviously, you know, Steve Coogan is clearly an Englishman, well known for it.
They gave him a lot of dialogue. A bit rough. It did feel a bit put on.
I mean, it slipped here and there, but to be fair to him, for a fair bit of it did sound American. It wasn't to the point that I went, oh, he's clearly not an American. But, you know, there were points where you kind of saw it coming through, and if you know Steve Coogan,
I think we should just get on to the ending. So the way that this debate, I guess, concludes is Stan decides that he's not going to have that press conference where he announces his retirement. No like major decision is made in terms of like whether or not they're going to turn the kids in, which will probably happen anyway because like that YouTube video got uploaded, and if the police get a hold of that and they decode the voices, then they'll probably be able to find and arrest the kids anyway. If Stan changed his mind, he could try and like pay them off, but most likely that won't happen. All of a sudden, Paul just becomes this murderer out of nowhere.
yeah, like it was really, really weird. Like he was just like, yeah, I'm just gonna go kill a kid.
Like his wife didn't say go and kill Bo, the kid who uploaded the video and stuff, and who's probably going to confess. She said go and talk to him. He was very specifically saying go and talk to him, and then he goes to like find him and stuff, and then the kid's like running away, and then he's like planning on bashing his head in with like a rock. But they don't do a very good job building up to that moment or really justifying it. The only justification you have is in his like internal monologue where he's saying, in war, you have to fight for your family. I love my family. You have to fight for your family. That's the most we get. But it's a very, very sudden turn.
You may as well do that. Why not? It didn't make sense, and you kind of just give up, like trying to get it, because it's just like, cool. So you're going to go murder your brother's son.
You're going to murder your step-nephew.
Despite not having that much of a history of violence, I mean, your kid does. So maybe they're trying to say it all comes from the father, but then make the father abusive, not the mother. That minor little choice there would have then given the film a bit of a through line at the very least.
He was raised poorly, and then maybe like as a result of him getting abused, he then had bad tendencies. But the problem is that you never saw any actual like violent tendencies aside from that one moment where he hits Stan with the pan. You never actually see him commit any violence, and even that moment, kind of a combination of an in the moment thing and a like you won't do what I'm saying. I mean, I guess you could say it was more of a pragmatic choice, but even for something that he thinks he's doing out of like pragmatism, it's still like not everybody would do that. Some people would try and do it using other ways. They wouldn't immediately jump to murder. You know, I mean, I guess the only explanation is that it's just like he thinks like, oh, okay, well, I can't do anything else, so I just have to kill him. That was an issue, but I thought that the final scene of this movie was terrible. And the reason why it was bad is because it just felt like the movie just gave up.
It didn't really try and wrap things up in the most satisfying way. It just went, we're going to have this big climax scene, and then we're going to have that happen. It's not really going to have that much of an impact.
And to properly describe what my problems with it were, like Stan just out of nowhere just goes crazy and just beats the shit out of Paul, even though it didn't really look like Paul had actually like done anything. There's no evidence that he'd actually like killed Bo or anything like that. But all of a sudden he just goes like, "What'd you do?" Like punches him to the floor, kicks the shit out of him, and just like goes crazy. And it's really like out of character for him. They probably thought that they were building to that moment, but I didn't feel like they built to it very successfully.
If they'd just shown that Stan had, a bit more of a violent rage against his brother at points, or seemed to be about to snap to a point, even when he's being pushed in the argument, if he seemed more aggressive there.
At best, you just get the implication that he's kind of just done. He's just so tired and done. And yeah, he seems frustrated, but not like violently aggressively so. And yeah, but he just does that. And weirdly enough, even the quality of the acting started to decrease in that final scene as well.
Yeah.
Gears, like some of his deliveries weren't that good. Like, "You are nothing to me. I am done with you." That was a really awkward delivery. And the same goes for Coogan when he's on the floor and he's like, I was just talking about, I didn't. And then Stan lost his marbles. That entire scene felt like, in terms of the staging, a rehearsal rather than the actual scene that they were using. Or maybe just an unused take. Like, the pacing of the conversations felt off. Even, like, the way it was shot, it looked like they hadn't really filmed, like, coverage for that scene.
Yeah.
Because all just from one angle with different cuts. And the way everybody was playing it, it started to feel like you were watching them just kind of rehearsing the scene, like what they had to do and the notes that they had to hit. And what makes it even worse is that Stan's bill being passed was supposed to be sort of an ironic final note, but it just ends. Paul grows in pain, and then that's it.
He goes, H was fun. And you're like, is that the point? Why is that the point?
And what does that mean? Is it supposed to be like, oh, humans are so uncivilized? Whatever points the film was trying to make become kind of lost because it just ends. Again, maybe aside from the whole ironic thing of like, oh, their family is in disarray, but at least his bill got passed or something. Like maybe they were going for that. He's succeeding as a politician, but at the expense of like his family. That was a scene in desperate need of a reshoot. Desperate need of just a final note, maybe. because it literally just cuts itself off.
It needed something that felt like it wrapped up the film, which it didn't have. Like, there's no closure to that, really. If Stan had done something like kill Paul, that would have worked, because you're like, oh, and then boom, that's it, story's over, because the cycles continued, yada yada yada. Like, I can see how you could get that to work. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I would have wanted that to happen.
Or maybe if Paul had actually killed Bo, that would have definitely given good reason for Stan to go crazy, and that would have tied up the story a bit more. It would have just been one simple change, just have Paul walk out with blood all over him. Overall, I mean, the dinner, it's less really, really terrible and more just really frustrating.
It just does not live up to its potential.
We've reviewed worse films, but I would probably recommend watching them more than I would this. They at least have ending. But this movie, barely a structure, annoying to sit through, doesn't end, just stops. Just can't recommend it overall.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to admit, skip this one. I'm going to end how the film did, with nothing.
We are going to be having another double bill of a couple of films, not in the same episodes, just the next couple of episodes will be on two films that are kind of connected. One of them, classic noir called Out of the Past, and the other one, another noir, this time kind of more sci-fi-ish, Dark City. Yeah, see ya.